Hello everyone. Today I will tell you about a criminal case that happened more than 100 years ago. In the 1880s, in the Whitechapel district of East London, United Kingdom, a brutal criminal committed a series of horrifying murders that shocked the entire nation. His method of killing was extremely cruel, and his name has spread fear among people even to this day. The true identity of this murderer remains a mystery. This case is known as one of the 10 most mysterious criminal cases in the world. He is Jack the Ripper. The story takes place in the late 19th century in England. London was one of the most prosperous cities in the world and attracted a large number of immigrants, including refugees. This led to a rapid decline in job availability, leaving many people unemployed. The Whitechapel area in East London, with its cheap housing, became the choice for many low-income individuals. Gradually, this place became densely populated with immigrants. The environment and security in Whitechapel were very poor. In an effort to maintain order, the London police had to increase their presence in the area. Day and night, police officers could be seen patrolling the streets. However, compared to the large population, the police force was still too thin, and the security situation did not improve significantly. Whitechapel was a complex neighborhood with all kinds of people. To survive, some women were forced into prostitution, having to walk the streets every day to earn a few coins. On August 6, 1888, which was a Tuesday, a series of murders that would go on to shock the world had begun. The first murder took place at around 4:45 a.m. in the Whitechapel area, at an apartment on George Yard, often referred to as Fudgio Rat. A laborer was heading out for work at the arsenal when he came across a horrifying sight on the first-floor staircase. A woman lying on her back, half naked and surrounded by blood. The scene was extremely gruesome. In a panic, the man ran out into the street and within 5 minutes, he found a patrolling police officer and brought him to the scene. Upon inspection, the body had 39 stab wounds, mostly concentrated in the lower abdomen and genital area. At 5:30 a.m., a forensic examiner arrived at the scene and determined that the victim had been dead for approximately 3 hours. The body was found on the staircase landing of the apartment building. Police immediately began questioning residents. One woman stated that in the early morning hours, she heard someone screaming for help. However, due to the high frequency of domestic violence and shouting in the Whitechapel area, she didn't pay much attention. 2 other residents said they returned home at around 2 a.m. and didn't see anyone on the stairs. Another person said he arrived home at 3:30 a.m. and noticed someone lying there. But due to the darkness, he assumed it was a drunk vagrant sleeping it off and didn't think much of it. From these accounts, the police estimated the time of death to be between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. The victim was identified as Martha Tabram, a 38-year-old sex worker who lived at 19 George Yard, just 300 meters from the crime scene. According to witnesses, on the evening before her death, Martha had been drinking with several other sex workers and 2 soldiers at a nearby bar. At 11:45 p.m., she and one of the soldiers left the bar together. A patrolling police officer reported that around 2:30 a.m., he saw a suspicious man wandering the street near the crime scene. The man appeared to be a soldier in his early 20s, with white skin and black hair. To look less suspicious, the police officer approached the soldier and asked him what he was doing. The soldier claimed he was waiting for an acquaintance and would leave shortly. After the murder was reported, this soldier became a suspect. 2 days later, at a local army barracks, all soldiers who were on leave on the night of the murder were summoned for a lineup so the patrolling officer could try to identify the man he had seen. During the lineup, the officer pointed out 2 soldiers who closely resembled the man he had seen that night. However, both of them had solid alibis and were eventually ruled out as suspects. Despite continued investigation, no results were found. 25 days after the first murder, a second murder occurred. At 3:40 a.m. on Friday, August 31st Street, 1888, a coachman was driving his carriage down a street in the Whitechapel area when a man suddenly called out to him. The man, named Charles Cross, appeared panicked and told the coachman that someone seemed to be lying dead at the entrance of a nearby stable. At that time, it was still dark and there were no streetlights, so the area was difficult to see. The 2 men approached the entrance of the stable for a closer look and found a woman lying on her back. motionless. Her eyes were wide open, and her skirt had been pulled up. When they touched her face, it was still warm, but her hands were already cold. At 3:45 a.m., a patrolling police officer arrived at the scene. When he shone his lantern on the woman, they discovered severe bruising on her face and several broken teeth. 2 deep knife wounds were found on her neck, and her abdomen had been slashed open, with her intestines protruding. The scene was horrifying. At 4 a.m., a forensic examiner arrived to assess the situation. He estimated that the time of death was around 3:30 a.m., just about 10 to 15 minutes before Charles Cross and the coachman discovered the body. The murder weapon was believed to be a long knife, possibly 15 to 20 centimeters in length, potentially a folding knife, a butcher's knife, or even a surgical knife. The way the victim's abdomen had been cut open indicated that the killer may have had some anatomical knowledge or at least some experience with knives. Regarding the anatomical state of the body, the victim was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years old. Also a sex worker, she lived at a lodging house on Thrall Street. According to the investigation, around 1:20 a.m. on the day of the murder, Mary returned to the lodging house. The landlord demanded payment for rent, but as Mary didn't have enough money, she left. At around 2:30 a.m., near the junction of Whitechapel Road and Osborne Street, not far from the lodging house, a friend of Mary's saw her sitting against a wall, appearing quite drunk. This location was only about 800 meters from the stable entrance where her body was later discovered. The friend offered to take her home, but Mary refused. She then walked alone toward the stable area. At 3:15 a.m., a police officer patrolling the area passed by the stable but noticed nothing suspicious. Just 25 minutes later, 2 men discovered Mary's body lying at the entrance to the stable. There were no other witnesses, and no one reported hearing anything strange. At one point, police suspected that Charles Cross, the first man to find the body, might actually be the killer. They theorized that he had murdered Mary, and upon seeing the approaching coachman, quickly pretended to be the person who had just found her. However, in the end, Charles was ruled out as a suspect. The true identity of the killer remained a mystery. Within just 1 month, 2 murders had occurred in the Whitechapel area. People began linking the 2 cases, as both victims were sex workers and the method of killing was similarly gruesome. The difference was that the first victim had been repeatedly stabbed in the abdomen, while the second had her abdomen slit open. However, the police initially believed the cases were unrelated and merely coincidental, citing a lack of conclusive evidence tying them together. But just 8 days later, another murder occurred in Whitechapel. At 5:45 a.m. on Saturday, September 8, 1888, a coachman living at 29 Hanbury Street discovered the body of a woman lying on the ground at the back entrance of a house. Her head was facing the doorway, just about 15 centimeters from the doorstep. Police arrived quickly and began their investigation. The woman's abdomen had been ripped open, and her intestines had been pulled out and draped over her right shoulder. There were also 2 deep cuts on her neck. The uterus and part of the bladder had been deeply cut and air had been removed. A long knife, estimated to be between 15 and 20 centimeters, was identified as the weapon. At the scene, there were also 2 pills, a torn envelope, a piece of rough fabric, a comb, and a leather bracelet found. The victim was identified as Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old sex worker who suffered from a severe lung disease and lived at Crossingham Lodging House, number 35, Dorset Street. The police interviewed people living in the building where the body was discovered. One person reported that around 5 a.m., he went to check the lock on the cellar door behind the house, as someone had recently broken in and stolen things from his basement. After checking the lock, he sat on the backyard step to cut a piece of meat. At that time, no one else was in the yard. Another person said that around 5:15 a.m., when he went to the backyard to use the toilet, he heard a woman scream. A female resident reported that around 5:30 a.m., she saw the victim, Annie, talking to a man on the street. She couldn't see his face clearly, but from behind, the man looked about 40 years old, a little taller than Annie, with dark hair, wearing a dark coat and a bowler hat. As she walked past them, she overheard the man ask Annie, "Will you?" And Annie replied, "Yes," based on all the clues. The police estimated the time of death to be between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m. at the scene. A torn envelope was found with a London postmark dated August 28, 1888. Based on this clue, the police traced a man named Edward Stanley. He was Annie's lover and often spent the night with her, especially on Saturday and Sunday nights. However, Edward provided a solid alibi for the time of the murder. Whitechapel was a chaotic and complex area, and no one had a clear view of the suspect's face in any of the related cases. This posed a significant challenge for the police. They decided to release some details of the case to the public in hopes of receiving new leads. Soon after, a rumor spread linking the crimes to a local man named John Pizer. He was a 38-year-old Polish Jewish bootmaker, nicknamed Leather Apron. He was known for roaming the streets and harassing women. Some tabloid newspapers published these rumors. Upon hearing this, the police searched Pizer's home and found 5 long knives. However, Pizer also provided a valid alibi for the time of the crime. Furthermore, he sued the tabloids for defamation and was awarded damages. 19 days after the case, the office of the local central newspaper received a letter believed to be from the murderer. The letter, written in red ink, was addressed to the editor and began with, "Dear Boss," claiming he had been, "The police are about to catch me, unfortunately." That's not true. When I heard them proudly saying the investigation was on the right track, I couldn't help but laugh. Especially the joke about Leather Apron, it was really funny. I hate prostitutes. I won't stop ripping them open until you finally catch me. Last time I did quite well. Didn't I? That woman didn't even have time to scream. How could you possibly catch me? I enjoy this work, and I will continue soon. You will hear about more of my fun soon. Last time, I left a bit of red paint in a bottle of ginger beer. But unfortunately, it quickly congealed like glue and became useless. Using red ink seems to satisfy my urges better. Next time, I will cut off the woman's ear with scissors and send it to the police. Sounds fun, doesn't it? Keep this letter safe. I will release more when I've completed some more works of art. My knife is truly sharp and perfect. Just give me the chance, and I'll get to work immediately. Good luck. Signed, Jack the Reaper. In the letter, the writer confessed to being the killer behind the murders and mocked the police. Upon receiving the letter, the police believed it was merely a cruel hoax and didn't take it seriously. They also chose not to release the contents of the letter to the public. Unexpectedly, shortly afterward, a 4th murder occurred in the Whitechapel area. At 1 a.m. on Sunday, September 30th, 1888, a carriage driver discovered a woman lying in the street on Dutfield's Yard, in the Whitechapel area. The victim was identified as Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old sex worker. When police arrived at the scene, they found 2 stab wounds on her neck and some bruises on her chest. The cause of death was massive blood loss from the severed left carotid artery. The victim's abdomen had not been mutilated. A witness reported that around 12:35 a.m. that night, he saw Elizabeth leaning against a wall, talking to a man of average build, wearing a long black coat. He heard Elizabeth say, "Not tonight, not tonight, some other night, maybe." Another witness stated that around 12:45 a.m., he saw Elizabeth being attacked by 4 men. One of the men, about 1.65 meters tall, with dark hair and a brown mustache, tried to drag Elizabeth into the street but failed. He then pushed her to the ground. Due to the differences in the method of murder compared to the previous cases, the police initially did not link the incidents together. However, just 45 minutes after Elizabeth's body was found, at 1:45 a.m., a patrolling police officer discovered another woman lying on the ground in Mitre Square, less than 1 kilometer from where Elizabeth was killed. The victim was identified as Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old. Also a sex worker. There were 2 stab wounds on her neck, and her abdomen had been slashed open. Her intestines were pulled out and draped over her right shoulder, with some unidentified fluid still on them. Her left kidney and most of her uterus had been removed and were not found at the scene. Police suspected the killer took them when fleeing. Police theorized that after killing Elizabeth, the murderer intended to mutilate her body as he had done in earlier cases, but was interrupted by a passerby. He then left and murdered Catherine in a similar fashion. While fleeing, the killer encountered Catherine and murdered her by slashing her abdomen. Thus, These two cases were likely committed by the same perpetrator. The patrolling officer who discovered Catherine's body reported that around 1:30 a.m., when he passed through the area, he didn't see anyone. Therefore, Catherine's estimated time of death was between 1:30 and 1:45 a.m. At 3 a.m., another police officer discovered Catherine's blood-stained apron on Golston Street. Not far from the crime scene, on a nearby wall, there was a message written in chalk. The content appeared to suggest that the Jews were responsible for the series of murders. Since inflammatory messages like this frequently appeared in the Whitechapel area, the police could not determine whether it had been written by the killer or if it had been there previously. Fearing the writing could incite hatred and riots if seen by the public, the police decided to erase it. The two murders occurring on the same night caused immense panic among Whitechapel residents. A group of frustrated local merchants, discontent with the police's inability to solve the case, formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by a man named J. Lusk. The committee organized locals to patrol the streets at night and monitor suspicious individuals. They also offered a reward of £50 for any useful information. 2 days after the murders, the Central News Agency received another letter with the following content. "I told you before, this is no joke. Dear boss, tomorrow you'll hear about the double event. Too bad the first one screamed, so I didn't have time to cut her ear off and send it to the police. Thanks for keeping my last letter quiet, it was hot stuff." This letter was also written in red ink, with handwriting matching that of the previous letter. This time, the writer signed off as Jack the Ripper, taking credit for the deaths of both Elizabeth and Catherine. However, police discovered that the letter had been posted 24 hours after the two murders, and the content only described details already published in newspapers. As such, they suspected that both letters were malicious hoaxes, possibly written by a journalist. Still, the content of the letters stirred public opinion. In the first letter, the killer said he would cut off the victim's ear, and Catherine's ear had indeed been severed. This coincidence led many to believe that the person calling himself Jack the Ripper might truly be the killer. In fact, at that time, newspapers received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. Most were hoaxes. However, the name Jack the Ripper mentioned in these letters was so unique that it eventually became the name used to refer to the murderer. On October 16, 1888, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a letter with the following content. "From hell, Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other half I fried and ate, it was very tasty. If you wait a little longer, I might send you the bloody knife that took it out. Catch me when you can." Unlike the previous letters, this one did not include the name Jack the Ripper, but it came with a small wooden box. When the box was opened, it contained half of a human kidney. This time, the police finally took the matter seriously. They found that the handwriting in this third letter was distinctly different from the previous two, and it contained many spelling and grammatical errors, clearly written by a different person. The half kidney was sent to the London hospital for examination. Doctors confirmed it was a left human kidney, preserved in strong alcohol, since Catherine Eddowes' left kidney had been removed and was missing at the crime scene. Many believed it was hers. However, due to the limitations of forensic science at the time, doctors could not confirm with 100% certainty whether it was a human kidney, let alone if it belonged to Catherine. Thus, some believed it could have been an animal kidney and that the letter was just another cruel hoax. This debate continues to this day. Following the appearance of Jack the Ripper, police received hundreds of letters supposedly from the killer. Most were proven to be fakes. However, the "From Hell" letter is widely considered the most likely to have been written by the real murderer. While police were still unsure of how to proceed, another murder occurred. At 10:45 a.m. on Friday, November 9, 1888, the assistant of a landlord went to 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street in Whitechapel, to collect rent from Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old sex worker who had been behind on rent for 6 weeks. Kelly lived in a small room with a door and 2 windows. The assistant knocked, but no one answered. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked from the inside. He then went to one of the windows, but it was covered by curtains, blocking his view. However, he soon noticed a small broken pane of glass patched with cloth. The assistant pulled back the curtain and removed the cloth. What he saw stunned him. Kelly was lying on the bed, blood pooling across the floor. The assistant immediately notified the police. Officers quickly arrived at the scene and began investigating. Kelly's room was small, with a bed, 3 tables, and a chair. Above the bed hung a picture of a fisherman's widowed wife. Kelly was found lying on the bed, naked. Her neck showed clear signs of strangulation along with 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been ripped open. Internal organs were removed. Her breasts had been severed, and her face was mutilated beyond recognition. After the autopsy, the forensic examiner concluded that the cause of death was a slashed throat, followed by dismemberment. The murder weapon was identified as a knife about 2.5 centimeters wide and 15 centimeters long. Given the similarity to the previous cases, investigators believed this was likely the work of Jack the Ripper. One of Kelly's friends told the police that at around 2 a.m. that day, Kelly borrowed 6 pence from her and left. Not long after, she saw Kelly approached by a Jewish man around 30 years old. They seemed to know each other. The man behaved suspiciously. He pulled his cap low over his face as if trying to avoid being recognized. Kelly and the man were last seen walking toward her home at about 2:45 a.m. Unfortunately, the police were never able to identify the man. Remarkably, after this murder, Jack the Ripper vanished without a trace. No similar murders occurred again in London. Some argue that from the 2nd to the 5th murders, all victims had their abdomens cut open, whereas Martha Tabram, the first victim, had only been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen. Therefore, her murder may have been committed by someone else and should not be linked to the others. As a result, the 5 victims from the 2nd to the 5th cases are referred to as the canonical 5. While Martha's case is excluded, this string of serial killings caused widespread panic in Britain. The name, Jack the Ripper, became synonymous with fear. To catch the murderer, the British government sent its top investigators to the Whitechapel area. At the time, the detective novel Sherlock Holmes was hugely popular, so the police even invited Arthur Conan Doyle, its author, to assist with the investigation. The investigation team noted that the victims shared several traits. They were all prostitutes. Most had been married and had children, and many were heavy drinkers. The victims showed no signs of major struggle, and even the first victim, Martha, shared these traits. Hence, some believe Martha could have been Jack the Ripper's first victim. Except for Martha, the remaining 4 canonical victims, Mary Ann, Annie, Elizabeth, and Catherine, had their throats slashed from left to right. Mary Jane Kelly's dismembered body made it difficult to determine the direction of the cut. But based on blood evidence at the scene, police speculated her throat had also been cut from left to right. Investigators concluded the killer had anatomical knowledge, possibly a doctor or butcher. Police examined nearly every butcher and doctor in London, but found no concrete suspects. The case even reached Queen Victoria, who pointed out that Whitechapel, near the London docks, received ships from mainland Europe every Thursday and Friday, with most departing on Saturday or Sunday. This suggested the killer could have been a shipboard butcher, which would also explain why the murders happened on weekends. Police reviewed shipping logs, but found no vessels whose docking schedules completely aligned with the murder dates. Nearly everyone in the Whitechapel area was investigated, from over 2,000 suspects. The list was narrowed to over 300, with 80 considered serious suspects, but still, no breakthrough. By 1892, after 4 years of extensive investigation consuming enormous resources, the police had no viable results and were forced to suspend the case. The case of Jack the Ripper became one of the most infamous serial murder cases in Britain and the world. Since his appearance, detectives everywhere have tried to solve the mystery. Even more than 100 years later, people continue to research the case. Several characteristics of the killer have been identified. He had knowledge of human anatomy. He struck late at night, when the streets were pitch dark, making it easy to hide. He came and went without being noticed. He was extremely skilled with a knife, acting quickly and decisively. He consistently cut victims' throats from left to right, suggesting he may have been left-handed or ambidextrous. The lack of struggle in his victims suggests he was physically strong and able to subdue them swiftly. Except for the first case, all murders occurred on weekends. indicating he might have held a regular job. He seemed to harbor a deep hatred for prostitutes, likely linked to a personal experience. Based on these traits, police identified several suspects. One was Montague John Druitt, a 31-year-old barrister. His father had been a well-known surgeon, and Druitt had been exposed to anatomy and surgical techniques from a young age. He had acquired significant anatomical knowledge. According to investigations, Montague suffered from severe mental illness. Both his mother and grandmother had committed suicide due to mental disorders. On December 30, 1888, Montague jumped into the river and ended his life, exactly 1 month after the last murder in the series. After his death, Jack the Ripper vanished without a trace, leading to the theory that Montague was Jack the Ripper. Another suspect was Francis Tumblety, a doctor born in Ireland who had traveled extensively across Europe. He harbored a deep hatred of women, particularly prostitutes. He had a bizarre hobby. During a dinner party, he proudly showed off a collection of female organs, claiming they came from women of all social classes. During the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, Francis was arrested in Whitechapel for sexual misconduct. While out on bail, he learned he had been listed as a suspect and fled to the U.S. British police tried to extradite him, but failed due to lack of evidence. Francis lived in the U.S. until his death. Another suspect was Severin Klosowski. Born in Poland, at 14, he became an assistant to a surgeon. He later attended several surgical courses and worked in hospitals, gaining anatomical knowledge. Shortly before the Ripper murders, he moved to England and worked as a barber's assistant in Whitechapel. In 1891, he left for the U.S. He became a suspect after he was later convicted of poisoning and killing 3 of his wives, which reminded people of Jack the Ripper. In 1903, Severin was arrested and sentenced to death. Some believe he was Jack the Ripper. Another surprising suspect was a woman named Nijinsky Williams, the wife of Dr. John Williams, a royal surgeon. In 2017, while sorting through the couple's possessions, a surgical knife measuring 2.5 centimeters wide and 15 centimeters long was discovered, matching the murder weapon used by Jack the Ripper. John Williams had an affair with Mary Jane Kelly, one of the victims. His wife, unable to have children, had separated from him. Some theorized that in a fit of extreme jealousy, Nijinsky murdered these women, which might also explain the damage to the victims' wounds. Another suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Jewish immigrant and barber in Whitechapel. He was once one of the main suspects. A witness had even identified Aaron as the killer, but refused to testify, fearing it would incite anti-Semitic violence. So Aaron was never prosecuted. He suffered from severe mental illness. In 1891, he threatened a woman with a knife and was confined to a mental asylum. While hospitalized, he became paranoid, refused to bathe, and constantly feared being poisoned. On September 9, 1919, Aaron died at the age of 53 in the asylum. In 2007, British businessman Russell Edwards purchased a shawl believed to belong to victim Catherine Eddowes at an auction. A lab extracted DNA from both Catherine and an unidentified man from the fabric. When the unidentified DNA was compared, it matched a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski, leading Edwards to believe that Aaron was Jack the Ripper. However, this conclusion was heavily contested. Experts argued that the shawl might have been contaminated long before testing, as it had been handled by many during public exhibitions. The DNA report was also never peer-reviewed, so its credibility was questioned. Thus, the claim that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper remains controversial, due to the limitations of forensic science at the time and the poor preservation of evidence. The crime scenes were not properly managed. If modern techniques and protocols had been applied, the case might have been solved. More than 100 years have passed, yet the identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery. Was he Aaron Kosminski, the disturbed barber, or someone else entirely? Perhaps only Jack himself knows the answer. That concludes today's video. See you again in future videos. Goodbye.